my name is Jeff Rolka. I want to thank you for checking out my video. Over the course of the year of 2020, I have been doing a couple different videos every couple of months on the SSL SiX. And this is my 1 year, nearly 1 year. It hasn't quite been a year. It's been like 11 months or something like that. But it's getting very close to the first year of usage of the device, and I wanted to do a somewhat broader scope review, overview of the capabilities of it, things that I have noticed, ways that I have used it, and some of my thoughts on suggested best uses for the device in the hopes that it will help you choose whether or not something like this or this particular device in general, or specifically, I should say, specifically this device, is useful for you. Normally I do singing videos and things like that. The SSL SiX has been an incredible help in the production of those videos, yet that doesn't necessarily mean it's right for you. So let's get right into this. Thank you for checking out the video. If you find that this was good, you might consider subscribing, because I do gear reviews from time to time, but again, mostly here it's about singing. So first and foremost, I've been working with it for a year. For the first 6 months, I limited my production of my YouTube videos strictly to it. So I did not use any other additional options, no other, outboard preamplifiers or whatever, stuff like that. It was only the SiX. It's important to mention at this very specific, early on here, is I have zero equipment sponsorships of any kind. So all of the devices, all of the equipment that I will be talking about in this video, I have purchased with my own money because I chose to do so, because I thought that it would be useful to me in either making music or my production stuff here, all that kind of stuff. No one is giving me equipment or paying me to discuss any of these things, period. Now, I do have some operational biases that I feel are worth bringing into play early on. One might think of them as sort of ethos for recording and production. In a nutshell, I want to create release-ready audio as early in the process as I possibly can. In other words, one might say, I want to track what I want to hear at the end. This is true of the videos that I do here on YouTube. This is true of my own personal recordings. This is not to suggest that I don't do anything in post-production, but I like the process of preparation for recording. I like the process of pre-production. I like the idea of performances, of executing a performance and recording studio as capturing device. There are a lot of arguments to be made for recording studio as mad scientist's kitchen, to cook it all up in post-production. And there are incredible things that are done in that capacity that transform recordings. And I must admit that I do some of that too, but the equipment purchases that I typically make are more about the front end of things, about how it is that we get into the camera in this case, or the digital audio workstation in the case of recordings, as opposed to what I'm going to do to it after it's already there. That being said, the cleaner it gets in, the better it's going to be to manipulate, the less artifacts, weird things you're going to have on it. So, moving on. Organization of the device is quite well laid out. I think in working with it, it took me a little bit of time to get used to the layout of it, but the more that I've used it, the more I feel that it was an incredibly, thoroughly well thought out device on the part of SSL. You have your first two channels, channels 1 and 2. They are the super analog preamps that SSL talks about. They have very basic, easy to use one knob compressors. They are currently active. Right now the piano microphones are going through those channels. There are EQs. They are not currently engaged. I rarely use much EQ. I rarely use any EQ in my recordings of things. I prefer to do that in post-production. But in using the SiX, it has been nice over the year to engage and disengage the EQ on the channels to see how I might sculpt things. When I was putting my vocal through channel 1 or 2 earlier on this year, I was using a little bit of the EQ as a sort of low shelf to just kind of get rid of any rumble and things like that that might be coming across the mic. Here on the pianos, I'm not using that. You will notice that I have cues 1 and 2 engaged. That I will explain a little bit later. Here you have channels 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. They are the 2 stereo channels. They do not have mic pre's. Monitoring source selection section over here. Monitor outputs, including alternate outputs, dimming, cutting, and summing to mono if you want to check your output in mono before recording. You have your G-series bus compressor up here. This is the level for your Talkback microphone, which would plug in here. I am not currently using it. It also has SSL's very famous LMC compression circuit, which is a really extreme kind of limiting compression system that they have there. Basically, once you engage it, anybody anywhere in the room using the talk mic is quite audible through the system. So in a room, maybe a larger control room, if you were using that, it could be quite nice. If you've got producers all over the place or somebody's like across the room, the people in cans in the live room would still probably be able to hear you quite well. Master bus level here. Some more routing options for the stereo bus. You'll notice that external input 2 is engaged. That's my piano reverb return, which is coming in here in the external inputs. That's a nice way to expand the SiX's capabilities without taking up one of the stereo channels for your effects return, which I've been doing pretty much the whole year. I experimented with a few other ways of returning things, and it is nice to have the fader for the effects return, but ultimately you can control more of the master return here in the foldback section, as well as controlling the send from each of the individual channels. There are cues on all 4 of the channels, or all 6 I should say. So channels 1 and 2 have both Q1 and Q2 sends, as do channels 3, 4, and 5 and 6 have both Q1 and 2 sends. All the Q sends are stereo, which is delightful. Moving on to the foldbacks. The foldback section is here. This allows you to use it as I'm using it as an effects send, and then I am returning it into the aux inputs. That does mean that I am using one of my potential Q outputs for an effects loop. In my particular application of the device, that is not an issue. If you wanted to have 2 discrete Q outputs, if you had, say, like a rhythm section with a drummer, bass player, maybe a rhythm guitar player, and they wanted their Q mix, this could be more problematic. And then you had like lead guitar and lead vocal and maybe somebody else, a piano or a keyboard on a different cue, then you wouldn't be able to have like a effects running simultaneously. You would have to forego that in order to have the discrete headphone mixes. And also it's worth saying that SSL SSL does say that the individual Q sends can power a set of headphones. I have not tried that because it would require some cable stuff. I'd have to get a stereo quarter-inch plug to a quarter-inch female stereo jack in order to plug my headphones directly into it. So I haven't tried powering a set of studio headphones off of the Q-Sens. If you were going to have multiple headphones off the Q-Sens anyway, you would need a separate headphone amplifier for each of the different Q-Sens that you're using. Again, I'm using that here as an effects loop. It's worth noting at this time that SSL claims that all of the routing options within the SSL SiX are of the highest quality. In other words, they would be noiseless and pristine. As far as I can tell, that's true. I haven't come across any routing option that I have tried where there has been any perceivable degradation of the signal. I have also, so output routing, you have monitor outputs down here again, and what you can do here is you have an alternate button, so if you have like two sets of monitors, you can quickly switch between them. You also have a dim. The dim level is controlled somewhat confusingly here in the monitor source selection. The cool thing that you could do there is that if you had two sets of monitors and you got the levels set so that they were of the same volume output, then you could quickly switch between the two sets of monitors. Like let's say you had a pair of NS10s and a pair of Tannoy Golds, so very different sounding monitors. Once you got the level set using the dim switch so that the volumes were equal, then by using the alt switch in the monitor select, you could go back and forth between the two sets and really get a fairly objective kind of sense of the different sounds that you are creating in your mix. It can be very useful in that capacity. The SSL SiX has dB25 inputs and outputs. I have chosen at this particular juncture to obtain a dB25 output. This was so that I could use the insert sends for both channels 1 and 2, as well as using the insert sends for the stereo bus. Insert sends on SSL consoles are always active. And so what that means is that when I've used the SSL SiX for recording, I have been able to choose whether I wanted to go directly out of channels 1 or 2. And what that is it is post, it's all pre-fader, but it is post gain or trim, post EQ, and post compression. So you can use the front end of the channel strip to send out to your DAW. I found that tracking electric guitars through that to be absolutely delightful. It is probably of the variety of preamp choices that I have, I like it the most. It reminds me a lot of when I was working in a studio and I was using a Trident Series 65 console. To put that into somewhat more subjective terms, very aggressive, forward kinds of electric guitars, the kind of stuff that you want to hear in rock and in kind of high impact music. A lot of presence, not harsh, but very aggressive sounding, very forthright kind of sounding guitars. I really, really have enjoyed using the channel DI output for that application. I have tracked piano using the stereo bus insert send, and that functions in the same way that the channels 1 and 2 insert send functions. So it's like an output DI. It's like using a DI. And I've sent the stereo bus insert send out to the DAW. It wasn't my favorite thing, I have to admit. It was nice to be able to go through the channels, especially to use the stereo bus compressor, and know that getting into the DAW, I was going to be able to get a pretty hot signal into the DAW without clipping it. And just have that presence to it. But I think in terms of tone quality, I would probably choose something else. That's just me. I think that if you were doing like a honky-tonk kind of piano, it would probably be perfect because, again, it has that kind of presence, that sort of forthright push to it that was so nice on the guitars. But I wanted a little bit more ease of it, if you will, than that. I would probably choose, I have a Neve Portico 5012 that I think is probably my favorite way to track piano. That being said, really excellent sound quality throughout the whole thing. When I have tracked multiple channels, so I've had like a microphone and I've used the piano and I've gone out the stereo bus, it's been really, really excellent. Clarity is excellent. You can get a really, really nice mix here on the SSL. In listening to it on the DAW in 2-track stereo, it translates really, really nicely. Great levels. Again, my bias here is towards release-ready audio. I want it to be as close to done when I get it into the DAW as I possibly can. And I would say that it serves that purpose quite well in my application of it. To that end, I think that the SSL SiX is a particularly good device for podcasting, or, as I also do, is teaching because of the multitude of routing options. You'll notice I haven't much mentioned Q2 yet because Q2 I'm using as a stereo output to speakers so that when I am teaching, and particularly I'm teaching remotely these days, I can have a nice set of studio monitors playing back my clients singing, and I can hear that quite nicely as it comes through the system. Additionally, I can then use the alternate stereo outputs to feed directly into a Roland Edirol R09. So you can't, it's a long antiquated device which is no longer available, but it's a wave recorder. So I can have a discrete signal being sent to the recorder, which is getting my vocal and my client's vocals all very nice and cleanly recorded. And then I can use the Q2 send to send the return from the Apogee Duet, which has their audio coming out of it from their Skype or Zoom, whatever. And that goes to the speakers so I can hear them nice and clearly in the room. One of the beautiful things about the SiX are the routing options. There's a lot of input, there's a lot of output that you can use in a variety of different ways. And this is where SSL's ethos on keeping all of the signal pathways as pristine as possible really makes the device quite compelling because it pretty seamlessly transitions between these different roles and the quality is always just exceptionally good. So as I mentioned earlier on, for the first 6 months, I only used the SiX with no external stuff. No reverbs, no preamps to expand the number of microphones I could use. I just used the SiX. To that end, I used the Talkback mic and routed it into one of the stereo channels. And the way that you do this is by engaging the Talkback in the Foldback section, thereby sending it out the Q sends, and then you pipe the Q send into channel 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. The left-hand sides of those are normalized to mono, so if you plug it into 3, it comes into both channels, and you've got a usable microphone input. So in that way, even though it really only has kind of 2 mic pre's on channels 1 and 2, you can use that Talkback mic pre to record with. In my case, I was using it as a second piano mic for the YouTube videos. It worked okay. It wasn't my favorite. I think that there is quite a difference in the tone quality of the super analog mic pre's as compared to the Talkback mic pre. I suppose that shouldn't really be a surprise. It still does have phantom power, which is really nice. I found that using the LMC in that application didn't really work for me because it picks up so much of everything in the room that every little pedal squeak, every little shuffle of the foot, any movement of any kind on the bench back here would come through, and it was adding stuff into the recordings that I did not find acceptable. But you can use that Talkback mic pre. It really does work all right as a second mic on some source. It could make for a nice color change, and of course the LMC is well known to be an additional color, particularly when you think about like Phil Collins and the drums that they did back in the 80s. It is an additional really cool color that can be incorporated, and it is nice to have it available. I think it's great that they've put 48 volt phantom power on the Talkback circuit because it does just open up the door for the variety of microphones that you could potentially use with that. Would I go back to using it in that capacity? Probably not. If I had to strip back my other equipment, then I would. And I will get to that more later. But I have been in audio production and in teaching for a very long time. And as such, I have acquired a lot of equipment over the years. And once I sort of got through that first 6 months and I cut myself loose, I very quickly started using an AMS Neve 1073LB preamp for my lavalier mic, and that's going into channel 3 on the SSL SiX, and I then put the piano mics on channels 1 and 2, and I think it's delightful. But that means that you've got to have a lunchbox and you've got to have an AMS Neve 1073LB pre to do that kind of stuff. The SSL SiX offers an awful lot. And if you're doing single tracks or even like 2 tracks at a time, and you can leverage those super analog pre's going into your DAW and then overdubbing over the top of it, I think that it could last you a very long time, and it ticks a lot of boxes. But already having a lot of equipment on hand, it just made sense to start experimenting and exploring other options. And once I switched over to the 1073 and left the piano on the super analog channels, I just really, really loved the quality that I was getting right out of the gate. Again, you're hearing me through the 1073, through the SSL, and the G-Series bus compressor is engaged. So there is that little bit of glue over the entirety of the mix. Just a voiceover right now, but there you go, it is engaged. At that point too, I also used the Verb to kind of give some space around the piano so it wasn't quite so dry. And I appreciate the fact that the Q sends are all stereo. I was previously using a Mackie 1204 VLZ Series 3, and the aux sends on that are all mono. So you go out mono and you can come back stereo, but it's kind of nice to be able to run your effects completely in stereo. I don't know that there is a great objective difference there, but it matters to me in the spatialization of things. It's nice even just to have that as an option. So I'm really, really glad for the stereo Q sends. I'm glad for the way that they allow me to integrate the reverb. I did another video about using that as a comfort verb. This also is something to consider if that's something that you may need. A lot of people talk about using the SSL SiX as an analog summing device. You would need 2 dB25 cables. I personally have not used it in this capacity. I have only gotten the 1 additional dB25 cable. Again, that was so that I could access the insert sends for channels 1 and 2 and the stereo bus. It also bears keeping in mind that you will need an audio interface coming out of your computer that has multiple line outputs in order to use that. I have a couple. I have the Element 24, which has been discontinued. I also have an Apogee Duet 2, which has also been discontinued. I did a bit of looking around. There are quite a few Focusrite options that have multiple line outputs, even very modestly priced Focusrite options that have 4 line outputs. That would at least give you like a rhythm section versus leads section kind of, like analog outputs to then sum in the G series, in the SSL SiX. You wouldn't even need the DB25s for that many. You could, in fact, do as many as 6, 7, 8, 9. It could actually get to 10 inputs before you had to start using DB25 connectors. You could use channels 1 and 2 as mono inputs. Channels 3 and 4 would be a stereo pair, so like if you had piano, you could bring that in that way. Channels 5 and 6, maybe rhythm section. So think bass and drums, you've got a nice stereo mix in your DAW, send that out to channels 5 and 6. Use the channel 1 for maybe lead guitar or lead vocal, channel 2 for a backing or harmony vocal or one other solo instrument. Aux inputs 1 and 2 can also be routed through the stereo bus, but you'll have no control over them except for volume. So you'll want to have the mix basically as settled as you want in the DAW before you come into the SSL. Of course, channels 1 and 2 will have EQ and compression as well. My initial thought was to also have bass on one of those channels, but the SSL knows that the channel compressors don't work particularly well for bass guitar, for sustained low frequencies. So that may not necessarily be your best option there. Alternately, you may also have like something like a Focusrite Scarlett Octopre, which in my case, the Element 24 has light pipe output. I can come out of that into a Focusrite Scarlett, and then from there have the 8 analog outputs coming into the SSL SiX. But again, to use the analog summing, you've got to have available outputs on your audio interface. So who is this for? Like why buy this device? I've gone over quite a lot of the capabilities. I've gone over some of my uses of the device. Who do I think this is for? Again, it bears keeping in mind, I want the best, most reliable, flexible, and easy to replicate sounds as quickly as possible in my production capacities. This is because I tend to switch gears very frequently. In that, I think the device excels. Even while I'm using it to produce videos for YouTube, I can basically leave it set up to also seamlessly transition into teaching. So a few switch clicks and I'm ready to go. There's virtually no time for transition. It is a very forgiving device to use, and as such, it is forgiving getting into the DAW. So you can hit it pretty hard with signal, and it doesn't break up on you the way that some pre's and channel strips can. It's very forgiving in that the SSL, the bus compressor on it makes the output of it very forgiving. SSL's manual indicates that it responds more the harder you hit it. I mean, that's true of any compressor, but it really does seem to be quite true. Since I've used it, I haven't had any kind of audio come out clipping, even when I've arguably done things that it should have clipped because I had an electric guitar that I was tracking and it just came out way too loud. And things were pegging a little bit, it still was fine. So it's a very forgiving device in the way that they have constructed the way that the circuits work on processing the audio, and I think that's particularly true for the way that the bus compressor seems to process audio. It always sounds good. it always sounds really clear and really, really good. Is it the most profound sound I've ever heard? No, it isn't. But it sounds really clean, really clear, really very professional, really good. Multiple stereo pathways. For those that need a lot of output options, maybe you want to have a affected signal for your guitars that have a load of effects on it and things like that. But you also want to take a clean DI. If you're coming into channel 1, you could, using the DB25 output, send a DI straight to your DAW. You could then also engage your Q1 send and send out a separate path that way. Now, let's just say you're going through a Fender Champ with your electric guitar. So you're plugged into the guitar, you got a 57 on the Champ. Champ's coming in on the channel 1. You take a DI right out, send that to your DAW. You process a little bit of it through the channel strip, go through the bus compressor, and then go out the stereo outputs for another kind of, call it, more dressed up, clean sound to that Fender sound. But let's say you take that Q1 send and you send that out through your effects chain and then bring that back in on channel 2. You could, in fact, keep channel 2 muted and take the DI out of that and send that directly to your DAW as well. So here you've got a pretty bare bones DI using only the compression and maybe some EQ if you want. You've got the channel and the stereo bus compressor for a clean guitar going out to your DAW. And then you've also sent the signal out the Q1 through your effects chain and coming back on Q2 or on channel 2, and you're going out the DI there for your effects loop. Now that's kind of an extreme example, but if you wanted to, you could do it. It's a very flexible device with many, many output pathways. And quite frankly, there's still more that I could go into, but it kind of gets to be a bit silly at that point, because it's just, the more that I've worked with it, the more I've realized how flexible it is, how I can send things where I need them and get what I want. So when I started thinking about who this was for, I started thinking about the solo artist, and particularly someone who was new and had not acquired a lot of equipment. You immediately get two very compelling microphone pre's that have inline compression and have some EQ. I personally don't use EQ going into DAWs, but I know that many people do. Perfectly reasonable. You've got a very, very great sounding monitor system that has plenty of gain. And you can return to the SSL and keep monitoring that way if you're doing overdubs through your audio interface. It allows you options for tracking. It allows you options for monitoring during overdubs. It allows you options for mastering if you want to take just a very basic stereo output from your audio interface back into the SSL, run it through the stereo bus compressor, or put it through channels 1 and 2, do a little bit of EQing and compression on the channel, and then put it through the stereo bus compressor, spit it back out into your DAW, good to go. That being said, for less than this device, a Scarlett 8i SiX, an API Lunchbox, and a Neve 511 500 series module comes in at around $1,509. And the reason why I suggest that is because the SiX doesn't have an audio interface, so you have to get an audio interface, or you have to already have one in order to use it with your DAW. And I like the idea of flexibility. The SiX comes in at around $1,600. So to invest in it if you don't have an interface, means that you're looking at least 1,900, closer to $2,000 after tax and things like that. And it means that you are effectively, and it depends too on your budget for things and how much you expect to be able to spend moving forward. But the SSL SiX super analog preamps, I think, are, speaking for myself, have more coloration and aggression to them than I would want to use across the board on all of the instruments that I might use in a recording. So for a new artist just getting started, I would want a bit more flexibility. The Neve 511 500 series module is the same preamp that I have in the 5012, which is a stereo pair. And those are some of the most flexible, lovely, versatile sounding preamps that I have available to me in my studio. When I just don't know what I might use, I go there first. And 9 times out of 10, I'm glad I did, and I stay there. The super analogs, I will probably always come back to the SSL SiX to track electric guitars. And I will certainly experiment with other things, acoustic guitars and things like that, but I think that they really excel at the electric guitar sound. Whereas the 5012, it's great, but it doesn't necessarily have that same kind of edge to it that I have available in the SSL SiX. But the thing is that for the new solo artist, flexibility and expandability, I think, are key. The 8i6 doesn't have an ADAT input. That's the one thing with it that I'm not really thrilled about. It would be nice to have that extra 8-channel availability for growth down the road. But still, at the price it comes in at, I think it's a very compelling interface. I want to state again, I'm not sponsored, and I'm not necessarily advocating for specifically any of these devices, but what I am suggesting is that there are other ways to get started that might offer you more flexibility moving forward than the SSL SiX does, especially if when spending that $1,600, the only way you're going to be able to spend another $5 or $6 is to sell it, which isn't necessarily what you want to do, because you're going to come out probably having lost a little bit of money that you could have invested in other gear that you can expand upon. And that's where I like the lunch boxes and the 500 series modules and things like that. Summing mixer. For those needing a summing mixer, that's another consideration, I think, that is rather tempting. I haven't done it yet, principally because I no longer have audio interfaces that have those kinds of outputs. When I was using a 002, I used to do some audio summing, but transitioning the studio into it and then out of it, the returns weren't necessarily, to me, worth what it took to get them. Maybe that would be different with the SiX. I don't know. I do want to try it out at some point. Those that have tried it seem to like it a lot. But for those who are at that stage where they want to do audio summing, and particularly if you've already made the investment in a lot of preamps or other equipment, I wonder about getting something like a Phoenix Audio or a Radial or a Dangerous Music D-Box, just investing in a dedicated unit for that purpose. Even a fairly modest priced Allen and Heath mixing console, I think, would be rather compelling as an analog summing option. True, they do not have the G-Series bus compressor on board, and that might be the one thing that separates the SSL SiX from all these other options. And I must admit that it does work particularly well on this device. In conclusion, I'm not going to sell it. I like it. I like it a lot. I started off, when I bought it, I thought of it as being for a fairly niche kind of market. And I still kind of think it is. I think it falls into this category of, like, I think the person who gets the most use out of this device is someone who's already made the investment in more preamps, who's already made the investment in their audio interface, who already maybe has a modest microphone cabinet, and perhaps wants to expand their ability to capture multiple live occurrences simultaneously in an extremely high quality mixing console. So for example, with taking like the 2 stereo channels and the 2 mono channels, if I consider them all mono, then I could do like a whole rhythm section, 2 mics on a piano, 1 mic on a upright bass, for example, or bass guitar, and then maybe 1 microphone on an acoustic rhythm guitar. And I could track all that, and again, I have to use external preamps, but I could capture all of that as a single entity through the SSL SiX. And there's some compelling reasons why that's a nice thing to do. Equally, there's ways to mic up drums and things like that, to be able to do that with the SSL SiX. So you might do like the Glyn Johns thing, kick, snare, overhead, and bass guitar, going mono on all those mics into the 4 channels and capturing your rhythm section that way would be really, really cool to do. But in my application, I'm not really doing that. What I want is release-ready audio. I want it to be as close to done as possible. I want the signal to be coming really, really close to unity, so I don't have to do any kind of boosting in post. And I want things to be very pristine, spatialized, panned appropriately, all that kind of stuff. The SSL SiX does that really marvelously well. I think it's a really, really well thought out piece of gear. Otherwise, all of that wouldn't be possible. The flexibility of it, I think, is a testament to the design that went into it. In my notes here, I said it's not a Swiss Army knife, but actually it might be. And I say that because the more I've worked with it, the more I've found that when I want to route, record, or move audio in some way or another, there's been a way for me to do it. It is an incredibly accommodating and flexible device. I know I've said that a lot, but I think it really bears thinking about as it might integrate into your audio work environment. It has a lot of flexibility. It's pretty easy to switch from one mode to another. Except in terms of plugging things in and out, like accessing where the cables are behind it can be a bit of a faff, but the actual switching of things on the console itself, the buttons, knobs, and things like that is quite easy to do. It is super clean throughout. Every audio pathway that I've explored on it has been absolutely pristine. The quality, therefore, is excellent. The sound quality on everything that I've worked on has been really, really delightful, lovely. I don't know how much more I can extol the virtues there. It really does sound fantastic. The monitoring options and quality are no exception to that. In being able to route audio to whatever headphones, speaker systems, or recording devices that I've wanted to, it does it. There is a pathway there, and it has really facilitated my work environment quite nicely. I wish it had a phase reverse switch on channels 1 and 2 or somewhere in there. Occasionally I do have microphones above and below audio sources, and in those instances you want to be able to phase reverse one of the microphones. It would be nice if they had included that. That being said, there's a lot on the device already, and I wouldn't begrudge them that. It is worth bearing in mind that if you work with low frequencies, particularly sustained low frequencies, it is a known issue that the channel compressors do not really deal with sustained low frequencies very well. It tends to get this kind of jittery thing, which you can hear in the other video I did. And that's really it. I don't know if this video is going to create more questions or answer. I think it's a great device. I think it's great for those that want that SSL color when they already have other, perhaps more neutral options available to them. The bus series compressor really does work, in my experience, the way that they claim it does. It's great. It is great to use, and it does an excellent job. If I think that there is any one thing that is of most noteworthy aspects to the SSL SiX, it is the routing. That is principally why I got it, was to have a couple very high quality microphone preamps, but the ability to route audio, create mixes that were different from one another, and then be able to route them appropriately so that I could get them to where I needed them to be for my own monitoring purposes or for the production side of things, the camera audio, as it were. If there are questions, please drop them into the comments section. I don't know that I will do more reviews on the SSL SiX, but if there's other things that come up, I'm not ruling it out either. Thank you so much for watching. My name's Jeff. Take really good care of your voices. Enjoy singing. Take really good care of your gear too. And hopefully we'll see you again. Bye.